Last lesson we looked at Pythagorean theorem. Today we're going to look at 3 new formulas that help you find information about sides and angles in a right triangle. So these 3 trig ratios, trigonometric ratios, we're going to look at are the sine ratio, SIN, the cosine ratio, COS, and the tangent ratio, TAN. And these basic formulas allow you to find information for sides and angles of a right triangle. And I just want you to remember from last lesson that Pythagorean theorem only helps you with sides. And in order to use Pythagorean theorem, you need to know 2 out of the 3 sides. So just a little bit about those formulas. All I want to do is introduce them to you today. And over the next 3 videos, we're going to look at each one separately. So SIN is the sine ratio, and it is used when you have particular information. COS is the cosine ratio, and it is used when you have other particular information. And finally, TAN is the tangent ratio, and that's used when you have some other particular information. Now in the formulas, you'll see the words or letters OPP, ADJ, and HYP, and here's what they stand for. OPP stands for represents the side opposite, so the OPP is opposite. ADJ is the side adjacent to a particular angle. And finally, HYP is the hypotenuse. And the hypotenuse is, again, special. It's really easy to identify. And that funny symbol beside the sine and the cosine and the tangent is the Greek letter theta. And theta is the mathematical symbol usually that represents an angle. Now, SIN, COS, and TAN, all those ratios, again, you can think of them as special formulas. Well, all they are for us is simply a button on a calculator. And as long as you have a decent calculator, maybe it won't be on your phone, but you see these buttons right here. So those are the buttons that we're going to be pressing quite a lot when we try to figure out sides and angles of right triangles. So here's our key ideas for today, and it'll continue to be a key idea for the 3 lessons after this. So our key idea is, as long as we have 2 pieces of information, we can find the missing part. So with Pythagorean theorem, if you have 2 out of the 3 sides, you could use Pythagorean theorem to find the 3rd side. But Pythagorean theorem doesn't find angles, and triangles only have 2 things. They only have sides and angles. And given that we're looking at right triangles in grade 10, we already know one of the angles is 90 degrees, so really we only have to find the 2 other angles. And those formulas above, the formula that we use, depends on the information given. So when we're doing trigonometry, if we can figure out what we know, then answering the question becomes really quite straightforward. So there's only one tricky part, the word opposite and adjacent. So opposite and adjacent, these 2 words that are part of, well, they're in every formula that you see above. Opposite and adjacent are relative words, and by that I mean, it depends on the angle you're looking at. And I'll show you what I mean. And I'll try to color code it. And I suggest you color code it in your notes as well. So I'm going to get in the habit of always labeling C as the right angle. And the nice thing about C as the right angle is the hypotenuse is the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse doesn't change. The hypotenuse is always the side opposite the 90-degree angle. So I'm going to color code the other angles, one of them blue and one of them green. So I'm always going to try to use ABC, but I guess it really doesn't matter. But again, remember, notice the first thing I labeled the right angle and I labeled the hypotenuse. Now, let's start looking at angle A. So again, remember, hypotenuse is always the hypotenuse. So relative to angle A, we have the two other sides, the legs. And one of those sides is the opposite side, and one of the sides is the adjacent side. So relative to angle A, this side over here, if I called it the horizontal side, this side over here is opposite of angle A. So when you think of the word opposite kind of think, we usually think of opposite as across from, something like that. So relative to angle A, this horizontal side is opposite. And again, opposite meaning across from. If that's the opposite of angle A, then the vertical side has to be the adjacent side. And another word you might think for adjacent is touching or next to. So again, with any angle in a right triangle other than the right triangle, because remember, right triangle special, you always have two sides, and one of them is going to be opposite and one of them is going to be adjacent. Okay, let's look at angle B. Well, relative to angle B, again, now the vertical side, well, the vertical side is not touching angle B. It's not next to angle B. It's opposite of angle B. And the horizontal side is adjacent to angle B. So this is what I meant when I said relative. Depending on what angle you're looking at, the two sides, not the hypotenuse, the two sides are either opposite or adjacent. And if we can figure this out, then figuring out the formula is really easy. So that's our key idea today, to make sure we understand what the opposite is, what the adjacent is, what the hypotenuse is, and then using that information, choose a formula. So let's look at 3 examples. And again, there are no angles labeled in the first 2, so I'm just going to call it A. So in this one right here, ideally, we're not going to solve today, but what I want to do is, if I did want to figure out how big that side is, if I did want to figure out what x is equal to, first of all, I want you to notice you can't use Pythagorean theorem because we only have the hypotenuse. We know nothing else other than the angle. But that's the great thing about trigonometry. Trigonometry has that angle letter in there, that angle place in there, and that's what allows us to figure it out. So again, we'll leave that for another day, but let's just figure out which ratio we use. So here's a little thing I'd like you to do, and here's a little thing that's really good. WIK. And here's what WIK means. What I know or want to know. And if you simply write down what you know or want to know, it's going to point out the ratio for you. So what do I know or want to know? Well, first of all, I know angle A. Angle A is 32 degrees. I also know the hypotenuse. Again, the hypotenuse is opposite the 90-degree angle. And what do I want to know? Well, I want to know x. And again, here's where you need to understand, well, x is the side across from angle A, X is the side opposite angle A. And then what we would do is we would look into our formulas, and again, hopefully we have them written down on a separate piece of paper or somewhere really close to us. And what you'll see is you'll see opposite and adjacent. And opposite and adjacent is the sine ratio. The sine of an angle is equal to the side opposite over the hypotenuse. Again, it's just a little formula, so we just need to figure out what parts we have, and then we're going to pick out the right ratio. So this is an example where we would use the sine ratio, and this is what we're going to do next video lesson. Okay, next one then. Same idea. Well, I'm going to label it A. I always do it A. And then I'm going to write down, well, what do I know or want to know? Well, what do I know? Well, I know angle A. And I know this side right here. And this side is adjacent to, it is touching angle A. So this is the adjacent side. And what do I want to know? Well, I want to know that side right there, and that side is opposite the right angle, so that side is the hypotenuse. So in this picture right here, again, I can't use Pythagorean theorem. I only have one side, but what I do know is, or want to know, I know the adjacent side. I want to know the hypotenuse, and if we look at our formulas, the formula that has adjacent and hypotenuse in it is cosine. So in a couple of video tutorials, we're going to look at practicing using the cosine and seeing how and when to use the cosine. Finally, this last one, and in this last one, here's what I want to figure out. I'll just choose one of the sides. I want to figure out angle N. So again, in writing down what I know, it's probably one of the best things to do. Well, what do I know or want to know? Well, I want to know angle N. And what do I have? Well, I have this side, which is the side opposite angle N, and I have this side, which is the side adjacent to angle N. And what I want you to notice is you don't have the hypotenuse. Now, if we wanted to find the hypotenuse, well, we could use Pythagorean theorem. But again, remember, Pythagorean theorem only helps with sides, not with angles. So I want to find this angle. I want to find angle N, and it doesn't matter what we do, Pythagorean theorem is not going to help us with that. So again, Pythagorean theorem only helps with sides. We need those trigonometric ratios. And if we look at our ratio, which ratio has the word opposite and adjacent in it? Well, that's our tangent ratio. So here's all we want to be able to do today. We want to be able to look at those new formulas, even though we might not know what they are or how to use them. And all we want to do is figure out, if we had to figure out an answer, which ratio would we use. Now remember, the hypotenuse is always the easiest side. I would recommend you label the hypotenuse, even if you weren't asked to. So again, in this one right here, it'd be a good idea to label that hypotenuse, because then you only have to determine the opposite and the adjacent word. And remember, opposite is across from, adjacent is touching.